Hey everybody, it's Romania Black, and welcome to JanuYaoi. So I originally wanted to start this series for a number of reasons. One, it is true, I don't like January. January is like my least favorite month of the year. There's just nothing that really happens. It's just where I live, it's cold, it's disgusting, there's nothing good going on, the holidays are over, and it's like, what happens in January? Nothing. And so basically, I have kind of gotten into a big kick of reading a lot of BL series and have stumbled into a lot of yaoi. And so, but there's a lot of series I have not seen. And so I was like, I really want to get more into yaoi and watch some OVAs, some other series that maybe don't get a lot of attention, but I don't really know where to start. So I did an online search. I was like, okay, what are some yaoi series that are just OVAs? I don't want to get into any big seasons yet because I'm watching a lot of shows right now. I just want like an OVA 1 to 2 episodes. And so there was a list, because as I've noticed, what the big trend with a lot of BL series is that there's a lot that are maybe 1 or 2 volumes total that didn't get a lot of continuation opportunities. So the animated versions of them are just like 1 OVA that covers like the first volume or 2, or maybe there's like 3 OVAs or something like that, but it's not a full series, which is sad because I really like BL and yaoi series because they tackle relationships in very different ways than just a typical heterosexual relationship that you see in other series as well. So I find it fascinating, but I wanted to explore some series, and I thought it would be fun for this month to look at BL and yaoi series across the decades, because there's a lot of really good BL series out now. There is Given, which is probably the most mainstream and one of the best ones. There's Twittering Birds Never Fly, that's really good. There's like Sasaki de Miyano that's coming out, I think in January this month or next month, that's supposedly really good. So there's lots of series that are coming out, like Tri-Cornered Window is coming out, or has been out since last fall. So there's lots of series that are coming out in 2021 into 2022 that are BL related, that are higher quality and have more in-depth stories and have characters that are really engaging and things like that. But I've been told that there's a lot of tropes in old BL series that are questionable, maybe problematic. But you know what? If we don't watch those series and talk about them, we won't learn from our mistakes. We have to study history in order to learn from it. So with that being said, I wanted to find a series from the 90s, a series from the early 2000s, and the series from the 2010s, and then round out with something more modern. And doing an author spotlight seemed like the best way to go. And is this also an excuse for me to wear a bunch of dresses that I've had in my closet that I've had no use to wear since the pandemic started 2 years ago? Maybe. But here we are. So this first series, I wanted to find a series from the 1990s that actually had an OVA I could watch. The problem with, I know a lot of you request retro series, the problem with retro series is that a lot of times it's hard to find the content that's in a complete form. So I found this series called Fake, and it came out in 1998, the OVA did. The actual manga series started in 1994, so it's an old gem. But the OVA came out in 1998 and covered the first couple of volumes. So what I would like to do is react to the OVA and talk about it in one go. And then I'm going to stop this video, and I found the manga online. There's actually 3 series of Fake. There's Fake, the actual Fake series that covers a 7-volume span, and then there's Fake 2, the second season that covers supposedly 5 volumes, but I can only find 3 or 4 of it online. And then there supposedly was a 3rd season of Fake, but I can't find it anywhere. Everything points back to seasons 1 and 2. So I think what I'm going to do is look over the first 7 volumes of Fake, and then Fake second, which I've found 4 volumes of through Amazon, and do those. And then if any of y'all in the comments below find the other volume and the 3rd series, then I'll kind of review that on my own time and comment back to you about it. But that way I'll at least get the first initial 7-volume series for Fake out of the way, and then maybe the 2nd season, and then come back and talk to you all about the manga as a whole, because I have a feeling that this series is going to give us the teaser of Fake, and then we're gonna have to, as an audience, go out and read the rest ourselves, which is fine, and I want to talk about it. But I'm pretty excited. It's from the 90s, so the 90s were a fun time. I grew up in the 90s, and I have an idea of what the animation is gonna look like. 90s animation is my jam. It's very nostalgic for me. I love it a lot, but it has moments where you're like, ooh, this dates itself. And so I'm a little worried. But like I said, we won't learn from history until we dive into it, right? That's why I poured this wine. So with that being said, I'm really excited, y'all, to get into Fake and see what this is about. I know nothing about it, by the way. All I did was look up how many volumes were with it, what it was based off of, when it came out, and I tried to look. There's like a dark-haired guy and a blonde-haired guy on the cover. That's literally all I know about the series. I know nothing else. So I'm going in blind and seeing what all is going to happen. I've got my handy-dandy little notes to take as we go if needed. But otherwise, I'm pretty excited, y'all. We're going to start out JanuYaoi with a little retro time machine trip back to 1998. Party like it's 98, not 99, and just see what happens. So finding a version of this OVA was very difficult, by the way. There were some sketchy sites, and I was like, I don't want to go to those. But luckily, some brave soul on YouTube, some brave soul, Hanazaki Yui. I'll put a link to this down below so y'all can go see the OVA yourselves. But they actually uploaded the OVA with English subtitles. Thank you. Thank you so much. So I've got a link to their video down below. You can go watch it there along with this. But yeah, it's an hour long, so good OVA length. I'm pretty excited. But let's dive in, shall we? We're going to see what all is up with old Fake here. The good, the bad, and the ugly here in 3, 2, 1, and let's go. Oh man, okay. All right, ooh. That was better than I thought it was going to be honest, because like I said in the reaction, 90s animation, I have a big affinity for 90s animation. I grew up in the 90s. I watched Yu Yu Hakusho, watched Dragon Ball Z, I watched Tenchi Muyo and Sailor Moon. So I have a big affinity for like 90s animation, like 90s into early 2000s, because it's what I grew up with. And there's just a distinct style with it. If you've ever watched Disney's Oliver and Company, there's that like grungy line work where it's not smooth and it's not necessarily like beautiful like Kiwani, but there's something grungy and gritty and real about it. And it's like hyper realism. So like in the police station in this, like all the papers and everything were hand drawn, like individual files and papers, and it's really cool. I like it a lot. So yeah, I like the style of this. I'm really excited to read the manga and then come back and talk with y'all after I read the manga and go over what I found out was, because you can tell this series, it's an OVA covering the first couple volumes, or at least the first volume, and so you can see where it's going to continue, right? So like the JJ character that's obsessed with D, he's going to be a recurring character. The Berkeley Rose, the new commissioner, I have a feeling like he likes Rio. So it's like there's going to be these characters, and then Cal and Bicky, which I didn't know Bicky was a girl. That makes sense though. Bicky and Cal being like these kids that, you know, old D and Rio's taken on to help, you know, keep them from being delinquents, right? But yeah, Dee Leitner and Randy McLean, who is Japanese American that goes by Rio. All right, yeah, I want to go over things that I really like, and I talked at the end of the reaction in credits. I'll probably use Given as a reference point because, like I said, Given is a modern BL series that is not only really accessible, but I think it does romance and relationships right. And when there are problematic elements, it addresses them in a realistic and very appropriate way. So I want to use that kind of as a reference point because for the most part, this is fine. There's just a couple moments I was like, we didn't talk about that. So, but yeah, I liked the self-contained story. It took me a while to figure out where they were. I was like, because they're from New York, giving me total Banana Fish vibes right off the bat. I got very Banana Fish vibes. I was like, okay, awesome, nice. Getting Banana Fish vibes and questioning that. The 90s aesthetic, perfect throughout it. Their designs of their faces, their eyes look like super large and exaggerated. Not very 90s Yu-Gi-Oh hair going on. I kept saying Tenchi Muyo and Yu-Gi-Oh hair very much, but the eyes are very distinct. So I'm wondering if the manga is very much like that too. But I like the self-contained story. They were in England at this manor on vacation. I like Dee being like, yeah, I asked off, and he like begged the chief to go, and then he paid off Bicky $100 not to go with them so that he could have this time alone with Rio. Begging for a vacation. Right. And then we have Cal and Bicky having these 10-year-old to 13-year-old kids having bets whether or not Rio and Dee are going to have sex or not. It's like, oh, you kids growing up on the streets, you know. but then JJ was introduced early on, but was not there. That was made a note, and then he found out they left and begged to go on vacation too. So yeah, flying from New York to England for this vacation. Here's the thing. So it's established in this series that right off the bat that Rio does like D. It is established that Rio does have a thing for D. He just doesn't vocalize it, right? And I've got a string I'm going to cut later. So it's established that he has a thing for D. He does like D. He just doesn't want to, he questions how serious D is. And like, is D going to make this a relationship, or is this something just physical? And so he seems more like the kind of guy, Rio seems more like the kind of guy that's like super into like a deep commitment. And like, no, if this is going to be a relationship, it's going to be serious. And D is so like energetic and vocal. He's like, just do the thing. And it's like, no. But so there is an element of it that obviously, and I know a lot of you will say that BL series fall into this idea that the one person, the one partner in the relationship is really pushing for sex. And the other partner's like, nah, I'm not feeling it. No, I would say that Rio outright, it's not like Rio doesn't like D and isn't somewhat consensual. He kind of is, because they make the point of saying like, D says, you could push me away, but you don't. And there's several moments where Rio grabs him and Rio doesn't push away. He holds him. So he clearly is comfortable enough around D, but D really takes advantage of it. That's the only thing. It's like D really gets like so into it, like, let's do this. And Rio's like, I don't want to. So I'm going to be very curious reading the manga if that's going to be like a recurring thing, or like the Arisa girl, she told him like, you need to express your feelings if you like him, like move forward. If that's going to be a thing where their relationship develops, that's what I'm curious about. So it's going to be interesting reading the manga and seeing if this relationship develops into something beyond that. That's going to be interesting to see. But yeah, so they do a really good job. Obviously, I guessed it was the old man. Like, at first I thought it was Berkeley, but then I was like, Berkeley seems like the red herring. He seems like the obvious choice to pick out. And then you find out he's NYPD. So he's in the state police instead of like the city police, right? So he's in like the upper echelon and he moves down to work with them. Funny that's going to be interesting. But yeah, I like that he's just randomly on vacation too and just stumbles across this case. But I pegged it to be Mr. Henry from the start, but I was curious to know why. And then the whole Japanese thing came in. It's like, oh, okay. It all ties back to it. So did I put not again? Yeah. I'm trying to figure out what I wrote on my notes, but yeah. So it's not a game. That's what I wrote. Yeah. So at first D does not seem like he gets Berkeley at all. He's like, you're treating this murder like it's a game. And he's like, no, it's not. This is a murder and we need to treat it seriously. And Rio agrees with him. He's like, I agree with D. We need to treat this seriously. It's not just a game. So I like, and I don't know, maybe the Berkeley guy's going to go after D too. I don't know. Because at first he seems like he likes Rio, but D seems kind of fascinated with him as well. It's interesting. And establishing that Bicky and Cal are kids. They're like, Cal is 13. And I'm assuming Bicky's like maybe 12 or 11. But yeah, and then JJ in that god-awful yellow suit. Oh my god, there's some 90s trends that do not need to come back, and that is one of them, with like the jorts and the yellow thing, looking April O'Neil-ish. It's like, oh buddy. But he's obsessed with D. Interesting. He wants the D. It's, it's interesting, right? So yeah, I felt bad for Arisa and Cindy, especially Arisa, who got like at first I was like, why does she have Peter Rabbit? But they're in England and it's where Peter Rabbit originated from. That's why she has it. It's like, oh, okay. But I felt bad for her. Like her and Cindy, the Cindy girl died for no reason. She just died because her friend, she was trying to find her friend. But I felt bad that they were like just short-term characters and they died. And they had that little card playing moment. What I like about the 90s thing is that there's no technology. It's like, there's not a computer in the office. There's no cell phones. There's no way for them. They say, go find a payphone to call the police. He takes off on the motorbike to go save him. There's like no phone to call or nothing. Like modern technology would have probably solved this in like 2 seconds, but no, we're in the 90s. We got to old school this, right? It's very good. I like that they established Rio I like the personalities they developed between Rio and D. Rio seems like he'd be like the lofty idealist, but no, he's the pragmatic one. And D is the idealistic, like kind of superstitious person. I like that. The ghost girl showing up, I like that random ghost girl thing. 90s rollerblades, why not? But yeah, so D having the crush, or JJ having the crush on D. I am very interested to know what all we get in the manga after this, because like I said, this seems like it's volume 1. Like, we got introduced to these characters. They're cops in the NYPD. They're solving cases. I like that. I'm a big sucker for crime noir. I love a good crime noir. Banana Fish is probably my favorite series because of it. I'm like, chef's kiss. So I definitely see the influence of Banana Fish in this. And I'm really curious to see what all we go. There'd be some steamy bits. They actually handled that really, really well. Like, the kissing and stuff was handled really well. It wasn't cheesy or over. The Kenny G, like the sax coming in was pretty great. But I liked that. But yeah, and it didn't get too out of hand. I get kind of really irky and uncomfortable when characters are like, no, I don't want this. And the other character's like, yes, you do. And they force it. Like, I really don't like that. That's probably my least favorite trope in any romance, is when one character clearly does not want it and the other one like pressures them into it. I'm like, no, that's not cool. But it seemed like Rio was consensual with this. He just didn't want to do as much as D. And so he kind of just pushes D away. And D does the whole ripping of the shirt thing, which I was like, but in the end, he doesn't pursue it, right? So again, there's questionable elements there, but I will be very curious to see what the manga does post this for that. But like, the art style here were great. I really liked the third act. I actually really liked. Usually in a series, the third act is where you start to be like, I don't know if usually the third act is where things can get kind of shaky or weak. No, the third act was great in this. The idea of him hopping on the motorcycle and going off in the rain, and then going across the ditch and everything, and then getting to the house, and the whole thing with the Sweeney Todd basement and everything, and just all the setup, and then coming through the damn window in the motorcycle. That's probably my favorite part, coming through the window and hitting how Old Man Henry survived getting hit with a motorcycle. I don't know, but it was great. Like, the third act in this was wonderful. I liked it a lot. So yeah, I'm excited. This is a crime series. So what I'll do is I'm going to go read the first 7 volumes now, and I may get into the next 4 volumes in the second series, but I'm going to read the volumes and then come back and talk to you all about what all I discover. So I will see you all very soon. Oh, so I went back today. I recorded the reaction for Fake, the OVA, last night, and I went back today and I read through the manga, and it's good. It's actually really good. So how it works is that the actual Fake series is 7 volumes long. You can get it on Amazon. I had like a Kindle subscription, so I got to read the first 5 volumes, and I had to buy volume 6 and 7 because of course I did. But there's 7 volumes there, and it basically ties together. The OVA actually covers events that happen in the second volume, and there's a couple changes from the manga to the OVA animation version. But it's 7 volumes that basically tie Dee and Rio's story together, start to finish, and it has a definitive endpoint in the 7th volume, and we'll talk about that. I've got lots of pictures to show you all of different screenshots from the manga. It's wonderfully 90s, but surprisingly really good. Yeah, we need to talk about this. And then there's Fake the Second that was apparently published years later in the 2000s, and there are supposedly on Wikipedia 5 volumes. Amazon only has 4, and the mysterious 5th volume is not present, and the 4th volume of the second kind of ends off where you think there should be another volume, but I can't find it. So if y'all link it down below, I'd be happy to go read it, but I couldn't find it on Amazon at all. And then supposedly in like the 2010s, there was a 3rd season with 3 volumes that was made, and I can't find it anywhere. So who knows if it really exists or not. But surprisingly, this is a really good series. I was actually really pleased with this, especially the first 7 volumes. The second season is kind of like post-credit things that happen and like little stories. They transfer to a different unit, and there's a different commissioner that's with them instead of Berkeley. It's different. But with the first series, the main difference between the OVA, and there are 3 main differences between the OVA in the animation versus the manga. First of all, in the manga, there is no Arisa or Cindy, which I thought was pretty surprising. But because the events of this story take place in the second volume, the first volume kind of encapsulates Rio and Dee's relationship up until this point and how they feel about each other. So you don't need Arisa or Cindy to talk about that with Rio. They're like, Rio, how do you feel about Dee? Because if you read the manga, you don't need to know that because you've witnessed all the events leading up to this. You already know how Rio feels about him. It's complicated. So basically, Arisa and Cindy don't exist, which is kind of sad because then we don't get the Sweeney Todd basement. There's that. There's also not really the ghost getting in between Mr. Henry and Rio does not happen in the manga. And sadly, the motorcycle hitting Mr. Henry does not happen in the manga. It makes sense now why Mr. Henry lives in the OVA, because in the manga, what happens is he corners Rio and Dee comes in and shoots Mr. Henry in the hand to save him. And there's no motorcycle, but there's no ghost girl. Dee just literally saves him. So there is that. But yeah, this series is actually really good. For being in the 90s, it's kind of funny, but the way they portray the romance in this series is kind of, I don't know if classy is the word, but they're very, it's not conservative. It's there, but it's not all out. I think when a lot of people think of yaoi, they think of, oh my gosh, it's just like sex everywhere. In this series, no. Now, at the very end, spoilers, we get that, but it's still very chaste and it's very classily done. So if you've never read a yaoi before, I would honestly recommend you read Fake. Not only because it's like a cool crime noir and there's actually a story and characters and it actually delves into the lives of these characters and it's pretty fleshed out, but because the romance is very subtle, it's very developed, it grows naturally, and by the end of it, Rio comes to realize what his feelings are, and it's very well done. And it feels natural and it feels earned. It doesn't feel like a forced relationship. In the OVA, the one thing I was worried about was that Dee is very assertive right off the bat. Dee is a very assertive character, but you come to get to know him throughout the manga, and there's more to him than just him being assertive like in the OVA. And when I started, I was afraid that his assertiveness, like when he rips the shirt off of Rio in the OVA, I was like, I'm not cool with that non-consent. But honestly, he gets handsy and they make out, and Dee clearly wants to do more, but he never pushes Rio, ever, in the series. He never pushes him. He gets to that point where they're making out and he's like, oh, do you want to get handsy? And when Rio says no, he stops. He doesn't get any further. Now, of course, as soon as he stops, then like Bicky or Cal or somebody pops in and they're like, what are you doing? And that the whole moment's ruined. But at no point does Dee ever really force Rio. There's one point where Dee gets a little bit to that, but then he stops. He stops because Rio's uncomfortable. He always leaves the ball in Rio's court, which I really appreciate. But yeah, the art style, it's very 90s. It reminds me a lot of Banana Fish, which Banana Fish is one of my favorite, if not favorite, manga and anime series. So I'm all about anything that reminds me of Banana Fish. It's very Banana Fish. Like Bicky wears lots of shirts. Like my favorite one that Bicky wears says Peace of Love on it, and it's like very block geometric patterns. I love it. Bicky and Cal are a very interesting pair of, it's basically like Rio and Dee are a gay couple and Bicky's their child. And also Bicky's a guy. I thought at the end there was a weird translation in the OVA and I thought Bicky was a woman. No, Bicky's a dude, and he develops a relationship with Cal over the course of this manga. Like they start dating by the end of it. And this manga does a very cool thing where it occasionally flashes forward. So there'll be chapters towards the end of the volumes where Bicky will be a 13-year-old and Cal is 16. And so they start kind of getting in a relationship, which, you know, a 13-year-old and a 16-year-old, but it's the girl that's the older one. So it's a little bit different than what you traditionally think. And Bicky clearly likes Cal, and it develops a relationship. And there's even one chapter where Bicky is, I think, 16 and she is 18 or 19. And their relationship goes even further. And that, I would argue, they get more risque scenes than Rio and Dee do. They're like, at one point, Cal and Bicky, spoilers, it's implied that they have sex, Cal and Bicky do, and Bicky's like 15 or 16 and she's 18 or 19, and they get it on before Dio and Ree even do, before Dee and Rio even do, and they're like in their late 20s. So it's very well done, surprisingly. I honestly like the idea of having these different couples, and it shows like the young love with Cal and Bicky developing. There's a Chinese character named Rai that shows up, and he doesn't really become like an opponent for Bicky, but Bicky kind of gets jealous of him for like 5 seconds, and then Cal's like, I don't like him that way. And it's like, okay. But there's that interesting development. There's also the development in this series. So what I like about Fake is that it does follow along a pretty good plot of them solving murders and solving different cases throughout these volumes. And occasionally they bring in Commissioner Berkeley. There's the character Max. There's JJ, obviously we'll talk about JJ. And then there is Diana Spacey of FBI. I love this woman. She's like this badass woman that comes in, and she's brought in to get Dee out of the picture. You find out that Berkeley, the new commissioner, he's got a thing, not for Dee, he's got a thing for Rio. And Dee doesn't like that, and Rio doesn't like that, and that actually becomes a plot point later on. But Diana is Berkeley's friend from the FBI, and she gets brought in to get Dee out of the equation, like distract Dee while Berkeley makes his move on Rio. And it ends up not really working out, because Rio comes to find out, Rio at the beginning of this doesn't really think that he's gay. And Rio is shown in the past to have had a relationship with women before. He's had a relationship with this woman named Charlotte in flashbacks that we see. So he's been with women, but he's not exactly sure how he feels about Dee and why, and if this is different. Dee, on the other hand, is quite open about his bisexuality, which I'm like all for. Like, Dee straight up says, like, I'm bisexual, I'm proud of it, I like both genders, it's cool. And I'm like, awesome, way to go, Dee. And he's very open about it, because Diana tries to make a move on Dee, and Dee's like, I like you, but I'm fully devoted to Rio. And it's like, aw. But like, Berkeley tries to comment on like the thing on Rio, and Rio at first is kind of oblivious to it. He's like, I don't know what's happening. Like, maybe, I don't know if Berkeley really is trying to hit on me or not. And Dee's like, he's trying to hit on you. And I love that Dee even catches him and like puts the files in between him. And he's like, no. He's like, stop. Which is funny, because Dee's really assertive with Rio at the beginning too. But he questions Rio later on. He's like, well, do you feel anything for Berkeley? And Rio's like, no. And Dee's like, do you feel anything for me? And he's like, I don't know. And then as the series goes on, him and Dee kiss, and later Berkeley sneaks a kiss from Rio too, and to which Dee gets mad about, and that's its own thing. But Dee eventually asks Rio, he's like, well, you kissed Berkeley, did that feel any different? And Rio's like, well, the thing is, I didn't really like getting kissed by Berkeley. And he actually punches Berkeley to get him out of the way. He's like, but with you, it's different. And it's like, ah. And so most of the manga is Rio coming to terms with his sexuality and how he actually feels about Berkeley versus Dee. And Dee, for the most part, is he doesn't push Rio any further than he wants to be pushed. Just like in the OVA, Dee's like, if you push back against me, I'll stop. He's like, but if you don't, I'm assuming that you're okay with this. He's like, but if you tell me to stop, or you physically are like, no, I'll stop. And I do respect that, because a lot of characters in the modern yaoi that I'm looking at, they don't do that. So the fact that Dee is at least consensual, like Dee's a very jokey trickster character, and he's like, yeah, I want to push your buttons, but if you tell me no and you're serious, I'll take you seriously, which is really good. And Rio actually comes out and he says he's jealous of Diana at one point, and he's like, I don't want to see anybody else kissing you. And Dee's like, what? And so, you get Rio's dilemma. He's like, I don't know what to do with myself. So, and Rio comes to terms with the fact that Dee and Berkeley are very similar characters, kind of like what I talked about in the OVA, that they don't like each other because they're so similar. But yeah, it's a good time. I really like, I'm going through the images now. I really, really like this series. And let me pull up some other ones here. There's so much that happens, and there's so many different storylines that are really, really well done in this manga series. I think one of my favorite, you find out that Dee is an orphan in this series, and so there's talk about family because Rio's family was killed. You talk about Dee. I don't want to spoil you all too much with the manga, because I would like you to go out and read it. It's pretty good. But there's a couple storylines I really like. There's a hostage situation storyline that's really, really well done. And in the hostage situation, Dee ends up saving Bicky, and in the process, Rio realizes that he's afraid of losing Dee, and he's like, oh, I'm afraid I'm going to lose you. And then that's what spurns him to bring their relationship forward and help it. And I also like the fact that Dee and Rio are both like father figures to Cal and Bicky. Like with Cal and Bicky, they become like their own children, and it's really sweet. They're like these two gay guys just taking care of their kids. It's great. But there's lots of good one-liners in this. And D becomes a much more nuanced character as well, because at the start of this, I thought that D was just going to be this straight up, like, assertive, kind of a jerk character that just wants to force Ryo to have sex with him, but he doesn't. He spends a lot of the manga trying to figure out, you know, like he says, does Ryo understand my feelings are real for him? I'm not just playing around. I really care about him. And he's like, I want to reach out and be with him, but I also don't want to push him away. And so there's this delicate balance. And it's, for being in the 90s, it's touching on some really interesting things. And I really like it. And so yeah, and then I have on here the point where D refers to himself as bisexual, and he's like, it's fine. But there is there's two storylines that I particularly like. One is when we find out that D is an orphan, and he was raised in an orphanage, and the nun. I was wondering why in the OVA, in the intro, there was a nun and a penguin. The nun he calls the nun that took care of him, sister, he calls her Sister Penguin, and because she kind of looks like a penguin, and as a kid, that's what he thought. And she's kind of like a mother figure to him. And so she's really important in his life, and there's like a big loan shark scenario plot that happens where the mother sister nun is put in danger, and Dee's all concerned about it, and we get this really cool in-depth look into Dee's character, and Ryo gets to see a different side of Dee. It's really neat, and they kind of grow closer in their relationship because of that. The other plot line that I really like is that the idea of family is tied really closely into this manga series, because you have D with his family, you have Biki, who's kind of an orphan that Ryo and D are raising, and then you have Cal, who's kind of like this kid who doesn't have a very good home life that they're kind of raising too. And then on the other side of it, you get Ryo's family dynamic, and Ryo's character is awesome. I love Ryo in this because he seems like he's very quiet and introverted, and then when you get to the storyline with this character named Leo, who you find out is responsible for Ryo's parents' deaths, his character like takes a whole nother arc, and like the artwork gets so much better. Like I've got some panels up here, but the artwork, it gets to be like banana fish levels of good. It's like so well done. The shadow and the lighting, like Leo's character's interesting. I won't spoil Leo, but he's an interesting character, and it helps Ryo's story where we get more nuance with him. And we get into the idea of, you know, Leo, the character, asks Ryo to shoot him, and so he gets into the dilemma of like, do I take a life or not? And they're cops, so we get into that kind of dynamic as well. Is it as good as Banana Fish? No. No. But it does kind of follow in a same vein as Banana Fish, which I really like. I like that it has similar themes and similar things going on with it that are like Banana Fish. That part I do appreciate. But yeah, so it's just a really good series. And so the whole thing with the romance is very much like the will they, won't they. And it more or less becomes a they will, just win. And what I like that this series does is it kind of develops slowly over 7 volumes the relationship between Ryo and Dee, where it doesn't seem forceful. And at one point, because Ryo's so distraught about something, he decides that he wants to try stuff with Dee. And Dee's actually really respectful. He's like, hey, you're being weird. I don't want to force you to do this. We'll do this when you're in a better place. And I'm like, awesome, cool. Like, he doesn't take advantage of him. He basically wants to talk it out, and they decide. He gets offended when Ryo's like, do whatever you want with me. He's like, no, I want to wait till you're in a better place. Like, my feelings for you are sincere. So, and he has this awesome confession, which I don't want to spoil for you all. I want you to go out and read this. So there's so much I want to talk to you all about, but they're very much spoilers. So as far as the other characters go, there is JJ, and JJ, bless his heart, JJ is obsessed with Dee throughout this entire series. He really is. And it does get a little bit annoying at some point. Like with Bixie and Cal, anytime Ryo and Dee are like making out or get somewhat more and more intimate with one another, Bixie and Cal always break it up, and they're like, hey, we're home. And they're like, we can't do this around the kids. And so it kind of becomes a humorous plot point. But with Dee, we actually do get a little bit more of JJ's character later on. We do get more with him. And he becomes more than just like an annoying character that's obsessed with Dee. He is just a fleshed out character by the end of the series that has more nuance and is not quite as annoying as I thought he was going to be throughout. Berkeley, same way. And then, of course, there's the chief. And I just love the idea that you have all these guys working in this police station, and everyone is on to the fact that Dee and Ryo are together. Everybody knows it. And they're all totally fine with it. It's great. The chief, at one point, D and Rio are in a hospital and they're in a bed. D gets injured and he's in a bed next to the chief, and there's just like the divider there, and Rio and D are starting to get intimate, and the chief's like, shut up. He's like, not while I'm around. And it's great. I really appreciate how open-minded this series is about D and Rio. Like the other cops, there's never a moment where the other cops are like, oh, did you know that D and Rio? They're like, we know that you're together. It's very obvious, right? And for being a series in the 90s, when this was not something that was out in the open and formally accepted by a lot of society, it's great that this series exists and portrays their relationship as one that is developing, and developing in kind of a natural way too, between these two characters. And you get the feeling that Dee and Rio do care for each other, and it's not just something physical. It develops between them. Now, yeah, physical stuff does happen. Yeah, and by the end of volume 7, yeah, and by that point, you've been with these characters long enough that you're like, get together already. And so when they finally do, you're like, okay, this is satisfying. I like this. And when they finally do get together, there's this beautiful scene. I'll show you all some pictures of it, but I won't show you the climax of it, obviously. But it's very tastefully done. But what I like about the scene when they finally get together in volume 6 and 7, when they finally get together, it's from Rio's perspective. And this whole story has followed Rio's point of view. It's followed how he feels about his relationship with Dee, him coming to terms with his sexuality. And by the end of it, when they finally do make love, it's from Rio's perspective. And it's very beautiful, and it's very low key, and it's very heartfelt. And then you cut to the next day, and Rio has to go, and he leaves Dee in bed, and Dee wakes up, and he's like, he's gone, that jerk. And then he's like, we did it! And you feel happy for Dee in that moment. You're like, oh yay, 7 volumes later, and you finally got the guy. Good for you. You finally got your man. I love it. And of course, Diana instantly knows what happens. It's like, it's great. And then there's even a post scene afterwards where these characters where Rio and Dee, at the end of volume 6 into volume 7, they've had sex, and now they have to deal with, okay, well, does our relationship change? What happens now? And I really like that, because a lot of series, they just get intimate and physical, and it's like, well, we've done the thing, now what? And this series actually does the now what. They have a conversation. They talk about their relationship and what's going to happen, and is things different than they were? How is everything going to change? And it's really, really nice. I love it. And they admit that they love each other. It's wonderful. I absolutely love it. And they both have the confession at the end, and it's perfect. And I won't spoil it for you, but... So, like I said, there is a second series. And in the second series, it's done by the same artist, but their art style has changed. Like, this was done like 4 or 5 years later, and their art style has developed and changed over time, which is kind of cool that their art style is different. Even though it's the same mangaka, it's changed a lot. And at first it was a little jarring because I was like, oh, this is different. But I love that it's just going on with their domesticated lives, and it just goes into like them eventually, like during the course of volumes 1 through 7 of Fake, they live in different apartments. And so it's always, they go to each other's apartments depending on where Bicky is, depending on what the situation is. But by the end of the second series, they're talking about moving in together. And it's like, oh yeah, it's like, that's so sweet. I love it. I love the idea of them being together and talking about like domestic stuff like this. It's really, really good. But I do want to talk about, there's 2 things. At one point, Rio and Dee both have to come to terms with how they feel about each other. And Rio is questioned by Diana, the girl from the FBI, and is also talked to by Leo's wife in the series. And what I like about it is that they question Rio. They're like, well, how do you feel about Dee? And he's like, well, I've always, been interested in women. I don't know what to think. And so it's great because the women are like, well, how you feel about him says a lot, and you just got to follow your heart. And I like that Diana at one point, she tells Rio, she's like, you don't need to leave him hanging. You either need to commit and tell him how you feel, and it's either going to be a yes or no thing, or you need to leave him alone and let him move on, because you don't want to string him along if you don't feel the same way. And I really like that. And there's also one line, I want to find it in here. There's one line by Dee. Yeah, there's this one part where it's during the whole showdown. There's a showdown between Leo and Rio and Dee. And Rio is being tempted to kill Leo. And it's very scary because you don't want Rio to kill someone and to murder someone, but Leo's coaxing him on, and then D butts in. And there's this conversation, and it's probably one of my favorite in the whole series, but Leo, he's like, oh, you're interrupted by your partner. And then D's like, I'm going to be the one to blow off your head before Rio does. And then Leo's like, making a murderer of yourself so your partner doesn't become a criminal. He's like, what a beautiful partnership. I didn't think there'd be any gay policemen. And I love D's response. D's like, I'm bisexual. I believe in love beyond sexual boundaries. You got a problem with that? And it's like, D, yes. He's like, bitch, please. I love it. I absolutely love it. But yeah, so it's just, this series, I was pleasantly surprised from start to finish with it, because for it being written in the late 90s, I thought that there'd be like a lot of non-consensual things going on, being a lot of like assertive, aggressive sexual content, but it's really handled very in a classy manner, very respectfully and elegantly for what it is. It's got the crime noir, which I'm a big fan of. It has a very banana fish style of humor and art style to it. The developing relationship between Rio and D is so sweet and charming. I absolutely love it. And it's very rewarding. If you are a reader of this series, it ends in a very satisfying way, that it feels like you've read and you're rewarded by the end of it. The mangaka has led you up to a point, and then it's a very satisfying conclusion, and it has a very happily ever after feel to it, but also has a very, the story's going to go on feel as well. So I was honestly, for going into this series completely blind and just knowing it was a yaoi series from the 90s, I was honestly really, really happy with it. So this is definitely a recommendation to read the manga. You don't have to read the second series. The 4 volumes that are Fake the Second are kind of like after stories. They're not really, there is a plot, but it's loosely tied to the main story, so you don't have to read it. But the first 7 volumes of Fake, volumes 1 through 7, I highly recommend, especially if you've never read the yaoi genre before and you want to like dip your toes into the water. This is a really good series to dip your toes in and kind of get a taste of it, but it's not lewd. It's not really, I'm surprised I bought this through Amazon, so I read the translated version in English. There are some cursing in there, and I was like, oh, we didn't censor that at all. It's very uncensored, but it's very accessible. Like, it's very mainstream. There is their relationship, but it's nothing like lewd, or there's not penises everywhere. It's tastefully done. That's what I'm looking for. It's tastefully done. So if you're new to the yaoi genre and you want something that has some substance, but has a relationship develop naturally over the course of 7 volumes, and it rewards you in the end as a reader, and it feel natural and earned, I do highly recommend the Fake manga series. I'm really happy that I got it. I'm probably going to reread it because I'm kind of in love with D and Rio's relationship. It's glorious. And plus, it's great to read something from the 90s and see all the 90s clothing style, to see all the architecture. There's like no technology. It's all very bare bones 1990s. It's great. So I highly recommend it. So if you've not checked out the manga series Fake, I definitely encourage you to do so. But yeah, so this is our very first installment of JanuYaoi. What a fun time. Lots of good stuff going around. I really enjoyed the manga and the OVA. But next week, I'm going to be diving into a series from the 2000s. Again, I only basically just went online, said, okay, what yaois from the 90s, what yaois from the 2000s, what yaois from the 2010s, and just picked a title that had an OVA and sounded interesting. So I'm going in blind, y'all. So next week, we'll have another series to talk about in terms of manga and in terms of OVA. I'm pretty excited. I hope y'all are too. But in the meantime, thank you for watching my ramblings. Thank you for joining me for JanuYaoi 2022. And in the meantime, I hope y'all have a wonderful week. Please stay safe, take care, and yeah, I'll talk to y'all again soon with more JanuYaoi. Bye.